in the Middle podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome back to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and we're just going to jump right into it this week because we're going to go into a topic that is really kind of near and dear to my heart. And I think it all depends on where you fall within the Gen X spectrum, right? So you have the 1964 folks who maybe relate to some of this stuff, but certainly maybe not as fully. I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing, but basically what we're talking about is hair bands. Now, hair bands are really what got me into rock music. So I grew up with parents who listened to rock music and pop music, and certainly that was all based upon the 60s and 70s. So I grew up with there's this Saturday morning or Sunday morning Ticket to Ride. I think it was Westwood One radio. That was all the Beatles. And then there was the Let Out, which was like on Tuesdays or something like that, which is all Led Zeppelin. And I listened to a lot of that stuff with my parents. But I was really at that point, and I think like much, really anyone of that age, when you're in your, early teens, or even your 11, 12 through your early teens, it's very much about what's popular. So it was Michael Jackson and Prince and stuff like that, which is all really great music, don't get me wrong. And I still listen to that stuff. But it almost wasn't like my own in a way, because everyone was listening to that, because I had younger parents, like my mom in particular, was very much into pop music. So we were just listening to that regularly. It was whatever the local pop station was. It was like Kiss 98.7 or something like that in Connecticut. And then, my dad was more on the rock side. So that was, CCC, ZLX in Connecticut. So around this time, a bunch of stuff started happening in rock. Now, certainly, in the 1982 episode, I talked about, Quiet Riot. And somewhere within there, you also had Twisted Sister. So these are the bands that were coming off of that Kiss phenomenon, right? So Kiss had really, at that point, kind of like peaked in that late 70s. They did I Was Made for Loving You. They went through their disco thing. And they have kind of fallen out of favor at that point. So they're going to be something we talk about in a couple minutes, because they certainly had an approach to kind of offset this by seeing what was happening in mainstream music. So 1986, a bunch of stuff all came out pretty much at the same time, riding this wave that was coming out of the Quiet Riots, the Twisted Sisters, the Def Leppards. So Def Leppard's Pyromania record, the only reason that wasn't number one on the charts was because of Thriller. That was a huge album. People kind of think of the, Pour Some Sugar on Me era Def Leppard. They were massive on Pyromania. And then, of course, you had 1984 from Van Halen. So they were going into that. I don't want to say the whole album was synth, because that wouldn't be fair, but they had a big, huge pop hit. Eddie was embracing synthesizers. So 1984 was this huge record. And then Dave leaves the band. So in 1986, you had the debut solo record by David Lee Roth, Eat 'Em and Smile, with that killer band with Steve Vai and Billy Sheehan and Greg Bissonette. Great band, great record. You had the debut album by the band Poison. You had the debut, well, I guess it wasn't a debut album. It was their third or fourth, but their first wide release, major label release for Stripers to Hell with the Devil. And then you also had, somewhere within that time frame, I guess it's between like 86 and 87. So you have all at once. You have Poison, Striper, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction drops in 1987. Whitesnake, although they'd been around for a long time, completely retooled their look and their sound. That's 1987. Eat 'Em and Smile was 1986. And then over on the Van Halen side, the new Van Hagar Van Halen drops 5150 in 1986. Just before that, in 1985, you had Theater of Pain by Motley Crew. And then Girls, Girls, Girls was 87. Rat was still a major phenomenon, but they kind of had a downturn in 86. I'm forgetting the name of the record that they had in 86. But anyway, a bunch of stuff was all coming out. So here I was, listening to all this pop music. And a lot of my friends at the time were in pop music. And when we talked about the formation of my early bands with Justin and Don, it was through them, like those folks, a different group of friends. As you're, in middle school, you have different classes, you start to meet people. And the rock thing was becoming very much a phenomenon. And to a certain extent, Guns N' Roses and that Appetite for Destruction record was really a big deal in the fact that it was all the LA bands, with the exception of Stryper, of course, were raunchy, and they're talking about women and drugs and rock and roll and all that. But Appetite for Destruction was a whole nother level of debauchery, and the band was living that. So that was something you had to get your hands on. So I was eagerly seeking out this music. And bear in mind, all this stuff I had was on vinyl, but I did have cassettes because I would record it because I would have it on my cassette player. And when I went to bed at night, I would put on my headphones plugged into my boombox, and I would listen to, Look What the Cat Dragged In by Poison in its entirety, or listen to the entirety of To Hell with the Devil, or Appetite for Destruction, whatever it was, or Whitesnake. But again, I had all those things on vinyl as well. But this was really a huge thing for me. And it was allowing me the opportunity to want to perform it. And it piqued my interest, which is why I ended up being in bands. And they were all so different. So even though they all had this particular, I don't want to say, they didn't all have a cookie cutter look, but certainly the whole glam thing. But you could look at a Poison, and they'd be very different from, let's say, a Wasp. And if you're not familiar with Wasp, that's pretty on the darker side of glam and a little bit heavier, right? And then someone like Stryper, they have all the yellow and black, and they're wearing the spandex and the leather and all that, but the message is very different. And then, of course, Motley Crue, kind of the look of Wasp and Motley Crue are very, very similar and similar themes in a lot of ways, but the bands all had something a little bit different, and they all sounded so different. So when I decided to do a hair band episode, and I have to be honest, there probably will be future hair band episodes to delve into, particular topics related to the era. But I wanted to see what was out on the good old interwebs related to the era, and how sometimes in looking back at things, nostalgia, there's a different lens that people look at it. So sometimes we look at things fondly. Sometimes we look at things negatively when we're looking backwards into things. So I was just curious, and there's this website here. Never been to it before. It's called I Love Classic Rock, which, by the way, Gen Xers, all of our stuff is classic rock now. Yeah, even the grunge stuff too. And they had a top 10 80s hair bands. So I'm going to go through this website's top 10. And I have to tell you, right off the bat, they got it wrong. They got it wrong, and maybe it's because of my own proclivities, my own choices, but I just simply think that number 10 is immediately wrong when we go through the whole list. And I think there's a glaring omission, and it's a band I've mentioned a couple times now. So just a quick aside. So I might have mentioned in one of the episodes, we didn't have cable for, much of my youth. I had grandparents who had it, and, I lived with my mom, but I would visit my dad, and he was an early adopter of technology, and he had cable. But there was this thing called Dial MTV, where people called in, and they voted for their favorite, video of the week. Or actually, it was daily, I think. Yeah, it was daily. So I didn't get exposed to some of this stuff. So my mom ended up dating a guy who became my stepdad. And he was a cable guy. He's like, I got to have cable, right? So we ended up getting cable. And it was either 85 or 86. So now, for the first time, other than going to friends' houses, and I went to one of my buddy's house and we saw Headbangers Ball once in a while. But now I had all this stuff in my living room readily available. So now I also felt like I was more in tune with my classmates and the people who were interested in this who did have cable. Because now I was able to say, oh my gosh, did you see the new video by whatever? So that's how I came to know some of these bands. It was just from Dial MTV, which was a great time. So number 10, boo, Europe. Now everyone knows the Final Countdown. I don't think there's a stadium or an arena that doesn't use Final Countdown. And my gosh, they had it in a commercial for like Geico Insurance or something like that. It was like the Final Countdown on a microwave or something like that. Anyway, I had the album. I forget what it was even called, but you know, their debut album might have been called Final Countdown for all I know. And they had, you know, the power ballad, because you got to have the power ballad. They had Carrie, Final Countdown. I just never thought of them as someone I wanted to, like, I didn't listen to them past like that very specific time period, right? So they were a big hit. Okay, great. They're of the time. Cool. They're not someone I go back and say, you know what? I really want to do a deep listen to an entire catalog or an entire record. I really don't care. So when we go through the list, hopefully I'll remember to circle back of the glaring omission that should have been replacing Europe on the list. So now, number 9. Now, I disagree with the placement of many of these because I would have them in a different order. Because I think one of the most criminally underrated, not only hair bands, but singer-songwriters of all time is the lead singer of this band, and that's Warrant. So to me, Jani Lane probably has or had, may he rest in peace, one of just the greatest voices in rock music of all time, and that's not hyperbole. My God, he could sing so well. And for anyone who never got past, you know, the cherry pie thing, their catalog is actually ridiculously good. Some of the later albums where he was trying to be a bit more serious and like consciously serious and not just letting it flow, some of the lyrics can be a little trite, a little hokey, but particularly on those first 2 albums, Dirty Rotten, Filthy Stinkin' Rich, and Cherry Pie, there's some really, really good songwriting. Just that whole era. And even though Heaven was their big hit, I think a song like I Saw Red is just a beautiful, heartbreaking song with so much emotion. But I think Warrant really got, I don't know, lost in the shuffle in some ways because of when they debuted. If they had debuted, I think 86, 87, as opposed to, I think it was, 88 or 89 even before they got started, they would have had a little bit of a different career path. But just such a good band. I saw them with Motley Crew. I saw them with Poison. And I also saw them as a headliner. And one of the most infamous tours, which I didn't get to see, it was called the, what was it? Blood, Sweat, and Beers tour, which was Warrant, Firehouse, and Trickster, which by all accounts was one of the most debaucherous tours in the history of the hairband era. But number 9, let's keep going through the list. I think I would have put him higher. Number 8. So number 8 is a band that one particular song I have had in my regular rotation lately, which is actually one of their later records. But they started, I want to say, 82, 83, and this is certainly where I think the older Gen Xers would have had this band probably on one of their lists of the time. And that is the self-named Dokken. Don Dokken, Jeff Pilson, Mick Brown, and George Lynch.